Kim Jocelyn Dickson, thanks for joining us, and it's great to be with you. I'll say for the viewers, we're going to be talking about reading to your children and how important that is for their intellectual development. And Kim, tell us how it was that you came to write this book that you refer to as the Invisible Toolbox. The subtitle is The Power of Reading to Your Child from Birth to Adolescence.
Well, the motivation, and it's great to be with you, by the way, Terry. The motivation for writing this book is due to the fact that I was an elementary school teacher for at least 32 years, teaching in the primary grades, also teaching upper elementary students. And I spent a good deal of my time teaching third grade, which happens to be considered a watershed year, which means that by the end of third grade, typically we want students to be able to be reading independently, because after third grade, they're not learning to read. We say that they're reading to learn. So what I noticed about my students was that there could be a very big difference in terms of their ability to learn and understand. And I understood that it had a lot to do with the exposure to books that they brought to school with them. And it occurred to me at one point that every student begins kindergarten with a lunchbox in one hand and an invisible toolbox in the other. And if that child has been read to, their invisible toolbox will be filled with all the pre-literacy school skills that they need in order to be successful in school. And so realizing all of this caused me to be very interested in understanding the subject. So I began exploring it and then writing about it.
When you were talking to teaching the third graders, and like every class, we all know as students there's going to be kids who can read really well and other kids who don't. Did you, as you started to research this, did you come to discover that one of the reasons that some kids didn't read, and there's going to be a multitude of reasons, some kids may be dyslexic, but did you come to find that those who didn't have any physical impairments, one of the primary reasons that some read better than others is that their parents had taken the time to read to them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what you can observe in students, what I observed was that with students that were really struggling, despite receiving extra help, intervention at their instructional need, it was as if there was some sort of internal scaffolding that was missing. It was if they had pieces of the building blocks that are required to learn to read that were missing, that required so much building or rebuilding. So as I've begun to do research, I learned that 4 out of 10 children actually begin school below grade level. And it really is due, we know, to lack of language skills, which means that they haven't been exposed to books, being read to, and a lot of conversation, actually.
What you found from your teaching experience, was it more or less consistent, or did it vary by socioeconomic factors?
Well, that's an interesting question. We know statistically that socioeconomics can have a lot to do with it, in terms of families having the ability or the knowledge or the motivation to go to the library, check out books, read them to their children. We know that when people are stressed and under difficulty, it's harder to do things like that. So statistically, we know that that is the case, but also through my experience, I saw over the course of the years that even affluent families can be missing this essential thing. And what I noticed over the course of time was that there was definitely a change in students long about 2010, 2012, which is when the smart devices were introduced, when iPads and iPhones began to be more ubiquitous and to find themselves into the hands of children. So I believe that technology has also had an impact on the way that we're raising children and what children are exposed to early on. Um, and I think that, you know, anyone would agree that reading to children is a good thing. I don't think anyone would argue that point. But I don't know that everyone understands why it matters so much. So I became interested in the neuroscience behind it and discovered that there is a pediatrician, Dr. John Hutton in Cincinnati, who works at the Cincinnati Children's Center. He and his team have done brain scans on children and done comparative studies on children who've been read to versus children who've had more screen time. And what they discovered is that there is a marked difference in those brains. Children who've been read to actually have more white matter in their brains. And what this means is that the neurons have been firing all over the brains, which is exactly what happens when children are read to, spoken to. The brain cells are making connections all over the brains, and they develop this protective covering that's white in color. And so what they see is that literally oral language experiences through speaking and reading change the brain. And so really that's that scaffolding that I was referring to a few minutes ago, that I could practically see in my students, that some children simply had this internal infrastructure and some children were missing that. So we know that 90% of brain growth occurs by the age of 5. So these first 5 years are extremely critical for development. It's very important that children are spoken to regularly, that they are read to, that they are nurtured. In fact, that nurturing piece is one of the things that Dr. Hutton discovered is such a critical factor in children's brain development.
You know, let me bring up, because you're touching on several things here and some of the key points within your book. As you just mentioned, the first 5 years are so important. That you also touched on the development as you were teaching. You could see when all the technology came out, and so you're recommending the parents need to manage that technical use of students, and that this is interesting. I think that children should get their own library cards. Now, some schools will have libraries. It's going to be a problem in certain areas, perhaps. Maybe there's not a library nearby, whether it's a rural area or even in some of the urban areas, or it might even be, of course, where people live in a dangerous area and they don't want their kids necessarily walking to a library, sadly. But people can get books in a host of ways. I know Goodwill sells books cheap, you know, for a couple of dollars. There's probably libraries at times where they're giving books away just because they have to make room. And when you are reading to your children, and we're talking here about reading from birth to adolescence, so I guess, as you say, the time to start is when? I mean, practically speaking,
Immediately.
would you start before they're 1 year old?
Oh, absolutely. You can even start.
And can I ask before you, so we're going to, as parents, I would think, develop different books as they go along. But what kind of books would we have right in the beginning? Is it more, I would guess, picture books, because they're not going to have necessarily the language skills, but they would have the imagery. And I'm also thinking that every time they're looking and interacting with their parent, this creates a mental and intellectual exercise that starts to spark their brain thinking. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Hearing is the most highly developed, along with touch, hearing is the most highly developed sense at birth. So some even begin reading in utero. I began reading to my son when I received multiple copies of Goodnight Moon at baby showers. and just continued right on. So yeah, it's highly recommended to begin reading at birth. As you said, that sense of connection with a parent, the attention, hearing their voice, all of those things, all of those nurturing things are extremely important and do stimulate the brain and stimulate the emotions. It's a very connected experience for us, for children. So starting out with, oh gosh, there are lots of books that are being published and sold today that are board books or soft books. Those can be shared with babies. Then they can, they may try to chew on them a little bit. It doesn't really matter. But picture books, yeah, are a great place to start. Nursery rhymes are very important too. And children love them because of the rhyme and the word play, and they're extremely important in terms of the pre-literacy skills that children develop, because hearing and being able to recognize rhymes is something that they'll need to do later on in school, but they're just fun. So I think following, your child's developmental lead when it comes to choosing books is really important. I've included a resource list of recommended books at the back of my book that's sorted by age. But again, you really kind of need to follow your child's lead in terms of their interest and their intellectual level. If you've been reading to your child from birth, they're going to learn so many things, so many of the skills that I talk about in my book, from learning to pay attention, which, believe it or not, is a skill that has to be learned, to a highly developed vocabulary. Vocabulary happens to be the #1 predictor of school success, to understanding the way that books work. All of these things are things that just develop unconsciously. They're not something that you're putting in effort as a parent to teach, or as a child putting in effort to learn. They just happen sort of automatically and develop naturally when we're just sharing the experience of enjoying a book together.
So we might have a picture book when they're very young, and then at some point you're going to progress to not just the pictures you mentioned, which is Goodnight Moon. It's also a book I used to read to my sons when they were young.
It's a class.
Yeah, and of course we have Dr. Seuss that goes back to when you and I were kids, even growing up. So you can update the books, and it's funny. We were talking before we started taping. When I would read to my children when they were, I don't know, 2, 3, and 4 approximately, every night they wanted the exact same stories, and in the same sequence. So it really did kind of build in a, number one, not just an intellectual foundation, but you're sharing that time as a parent with your kid, and they're bonding with you, but they're bonding emotionally over reading. So unconsciously, you're communicating to your children, this is a good thing, reading's a good thing to do. And, it's funny, years later, when my middle son, I remember one night, they became fans of the Harry Potter books. And these, of course, were thick books. I've not read them, but, these are not, 100 pages. These are like 400, 500, or 600-page books. And my son was like, going up to his room and close it, goes, oh, I can't wait. I'm going to be reading this book. And he was like going to be staying up all night as if he was going to watch a great movie. And it just, that moment, as I'm repeating it now, stuck with me, that who would have thought, I remember saying at the time, who would have thought what you needed to get kids to read was a good book? But, reading a book is different than watching a movie. It is intellectually more engaging, and you're using your imagination, you're visualizing as you're reading, as we all did, progressing to books, from books that had pictures to books that were all textual based. So that really makes a difference. And I would also think, as you're reading as a parent to your children, they are going to learn from an auditory input, just language skills. I know, listening to my dad at the dinner table, expanded my vocabulary as a child. So, as a teacher, how does this all fit in together, and how does it manifest itself in the classroom from your
Well,
own
that's
experience?
exactly what the Invisible Toolbox is all about. I really wrote it from the perspective of being a teacher. And these are, when a child has been read to, all of the things that you just described are exactly what happens. They understand before they ever come to school that there is a reward in this thing we call reading. And so they come to school motivated to learn. And then all of the language exposure that you just mentioned is just critical in every aspect of learning when it comes to school, not just the subject of reading, but really every subject. So specifically, those highly developed language skills that a child will come to school with will impact their writing. Children who have been read to and steeped in stories just kind of have an instinctive understanding of the way that words go together, the way that sentences are constructed, and they've got the vocabulary with which to work when it comes to setting pencil to paper themselves. Their grammar skills are intuitive because, again, they really understand the way that, like I said, sentences are put together. And so when you teach about things like verbs and nouns and adjectives, it's not just an abstract subject. They have something to hang that on because of the experience that they have with language. So introducing your child to reading and the pleasure of reading is, as I wrote in the subtitle, one of the most powerful things that you can do to help your child's development and give them the tools that they need to do well in school.
It's shocking. We do a lot of coverage of political matters and public policy matters, and what we see in schools across the nation, certainly in the urban areas, in Chicago, in St. Louis, I'm sure you could pick almost any major city, and where we have an enormous amount of money being spent. In Chicago, it's approximately $28,000 per pupil, and yet only a fraction, something like only 10% of the children are reading at grade level. And I think this is as what we are talking about is not just it sounds like a cute thing to do with your kids, and it may be, but it's so critically important when I've talked to teachers over the years in covering journalism, and not all kids are coming from the same families. And if you're coming from a well-established middle-class family, it's going to have certain values. And I've talked to educators who they talk about the social capital, that if your family takes you on vacation, you may go to a museum and you may go to see the Grand Canyon. And so you're learning along the way if you're in one of those families. But other kids are coming from impoverished families where maybe it's one parent and that person is working and they're just not there. So this what we're talking about has such enormous impact. Let's talk a bit of what you also discussed, but why is it so important for parents to have to be the managers, especially again, of the younger children before fifth grade, of their use of technology, which didn't exist when you and I were growing up?
Well, I think that we all know how powerful and addictive technology is. I mean, it is a wonderful thing. But the flip side of that is that for children with developing brains, as Dr. Hutton's study shows, it literally impacts their physical brain development. I have a lot of empathy for young parents today because I think it's got to be one of the most challenging times ever in which to raise children, because technology is everywhere. It's got a really central place in many schools now too, and a stronger place than really I feel should be there especially for young children. But I think, I really encourage young parents to make decisions as early as possible, maybe even before your child is born, about how you're going to manage it. in your household. The American Association of Pediatrics recommends no screens at all for children under the age of 2. But I take an even harder line than that in a way, and I really feel that individual screen use should only come after a child has been introduced to reading for pleasure and has already fallen in love with it. Because what I've seen is that it is so easy to displace a tentative grasp or habit, maybe I should say, of reading for pleasure, reading independently. So, and when screens are used early on, say for watching movies or videos, it's important for a parent to watch with a child, to not just put them in front of a screen as a babysitter. If that can be helped, we know that, again, and with busy households, 2 parents working, it's a tough thing, and it's very tempting to do that. In fact, one of the most popular Netflix shows in recent years, especially during the pandemic, was a preschool show called Coco Melon that was geared to the baby toddler preschool crowd.
And why did you call the book The Invisible Toolbox?
It was like kind of a moment, an epiphany when I was a 3rd grade teacher, and I realized that, as you alluded to a moment ago, the entry into school is not a playing field. Children do not all come as a blank slate, prepared to take in what is offered to them when they come to school for the first time. They come with toolboxes. As I said, a lunchbox in one hand and an invisible toolbox in the other. And that toolbox, hopefully, is filled with the pre-literacy skills that they will gain when they've been read to, when they've been spoken to. It's a metaphor, I think, for what a child comes to school with. And of course, what it really is about that development that occurs when they have a nurturing experience of reading with a parent.
We have your website that we brought up, theinvisibletoobox.org, if people want more information. If they want to get your book, do they order it from your website? Is it available in bookstores across the country?
It's available.com, Amazon, Indie Books, just about any place that you can buy books. I've got tabs on my website, but I don't sell directly myself.
Okay. Well, Kim Jocelyn Dickson, thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to maybe talking with you again on an update in the future.